My mother called me the night before her 60th birthday and said, "Don't come tomorrow, your stepsister needs to be the only daughter there." My mother called me the night before her 60th birthday and said something I still hear in my head when everything is quiet. "Don't come tomorrow," she said, her voice calm, almost distracted. "Rebecca needs to feel like the only daughter." I stood in my kitchen holding the gift I'd spent 3 months making for her, an old-fashioned photo album filled with pictures from every year of her life. I tracked down relatives I barely spoke to anymore, begged for photos from boxes in attics and albums tucked away in closets. I'd labeled every page by hand. I thought it would make her cry. Instead, I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. I asked her what she meant, because surely I'd misheard. It was her birthday. I'd never missed one in my entire life. I told her I'd even written a speech. She sighed, the way she used to when I was a child and asked too many questions. She said Rebecca felt uncomfortable around me, that she needed space to bond without competition. Competition. The word felt unreal. Rebecca was 32 years old and had been my stepsister for less than a year. I was her daughter, her only child for 34 years. I reminded her of that, my voice shaking even as I tried to keep it steady. There was a long silence on the line, and then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said I'd already had my time. That Rebecca needed a chance to catch up. I drove to her house immediately. It was late, almost 10, but the lights were on and I could see movement through the windows. Decorations were already going up. Cars filled the driveway. My aunts, my cousins. Everyone was there except me. I knocked, and my stepfather answered with an expression that looked more like guilt than surprise. He told me maybe it wasn't a good time, that I should come back another day. Before he could shut the door, I saw my mother in the living room, hanging streamers beside Rebecca. I called out to her, and she froze like she'd been caught doing something wrong. Rebecca leaned in and whispered something. My mother nodded. She came to the door but didn't invite me inside. She reminded me that we'd already discussed it. Tomorrow was Rebecca's moment. I looked past her and saw a large banner stretched across the wall. It read "Happy Birthday, Mom," and underneath it was a photo, my mother and Rebecca, smiling, arms linked. Just the two of them. I asked where the photos of me were. I'd grown up in that house. Every wall used to tell my story. But now every frame showed Rebecca or my mother with her new husband. My mother smiled and said Rebecca had worked very hard on the display. That she'd done such a good job. My aunt came to the door then, confused, asking why I was standing outside. My mother straightened and told her I wasn't coming tomorrow and that we'd all agreed it was best. I hadn't agreed to anything. When my aunt pushed back, Rebecca appeared holding a cake decorating tool like a prop, her eyes already filling with tears. She said I was triggering for her. That my presence reminded her of childhood trauma. Everyone went quiet. I asked what trauma she meant, because we hadn't even known each other until the year before. Rebecca cried harder and said I looked exactly like her childhood bully. My mother put an arm around her like she was protecting something fragile. She said Rebecca needed real family support. When my aunt laughed in disbelief and reminded her that I was her daughter, my mother's face hardened. She said some bonds were stronger than blood. That Howard and Rebecca were her family now. Someone asked about the final head count for the party, and my mother answered without hesitation. Everyone except me. I stood there feeling like I'd been erased while they planned a celebration in front of my face. When I asked what was really going on, whether Rebecca had said something or threatened something, Rebecca burst into tears and accused me of attacking her. My mother followed her inside immediately. My stepfather told me to leave. That I was upsetting everyone. My aunt pulled me away and told me to get in her car. That's when she told me the truth. My mother had changed her will. Everything, house, savings, jewelry, was being left to Rebecca. Even the pieces my grandmother had specifically left to me. She said my mother claimed Rebecca was terminally ill. That she didn't have much time left. That I'd already had decades of love, but Rebecca only had months. I felt sick. My aunt didn't believe it. She thought Rebecca was lying. But my mother believed her completely. That night set everything in motion. We didn't sleep. We started asking questions. We started checking records. And within hours, the story my mother believed so fiercely began to unravel in ways none of us were prepared for. By sunrise the next morning, none of us were pretending this was just a family disagreement anymore. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and the speed at which my mother had cut me out of her life didn't feel natural. My Aunt Diane called my cousin Lisa first because Lisa worked as a nurse at the same hospital Rebecca had claimed was treating her. Diane didn't accuse anyone of anything. She just asked a simple question. Whether Lisa could quietly check if Rebecca had ever been treated there for anything serious. Lisa hesitated, reminding us she couldn't access private records illegally, but she agreed to verify what was publicly and professionally appropriate. A few hours later, we were sitting at Lisa's kitchen table staring at her laptop while she logged into the hospital system. The screen took forever to load, and the longer it took, the tighter my chest felt. When Rebecca's name finally appeared, Lisa scrolled slowly, her brow furrowing more with each page. There were no oncology visits. No chemotherapy. No cardiology consults. No long-term treatment plans. Just a sprained wrist from years earlier and a routine flu visit. Lisa printed everything she was allowed to and slid the papers across the table to me. Rebecca wasn't dying. She wasn't even sick. That realization hit me harder than I expected. Part of me had been bracing for bad news, preparing myself to feel guilty for doubting a dying woman. But this wasn't doubt anymore. This was proof. And proof meant my mother had been manipulated into erasing me. We showed the records to my cousin Tom later that afternoon, and he was so furious he punched the wall of Diane's garage. None of us said anything for a long time. Then Diane said what we were all thinking. If Rebecca lied about this, she was lying about everything. She called a private investigator she knew through her courthouse job, a man named Dylan who specialized in fraud and elder manipulation. She explained the situation in clipped, factual sentences. Dylan didn't sound shocked. He sounded interested. He agreed to start looking into Rebecca's background immediately. That night, we made lists. Everything strange Rebecca had ever said. Every inconsistency. Every way she'd isolated my mother from people who questioned her. By morning, the list was 3 pages long. Diane also contacted a family lawyer named Abigail who handled cases involving undue influence. When we met her that afternoon, she didn't sugarcoat anything. Proving manipulation was hard, she said, but not impossible. The sudden will change, the isolation, the fake illness, these were classic warning signs. She told us to document everything from that point forward. Every call. Every message. Every interaction. Manipulators panicked when they felt exposed, she warned, and things often escalated fast. She was right. I tried calling my mother every day that week. She didn't answer once. I left messages telling her I loved her. Texted to ask if she was okay. Nothing. On the 8th day, my stepfather finally picked up. He told me Rebecca had suffered a health crisis after the party and my mother couldn't handle any additional stress. When I asked what kind of crisis, he couldn't give a straight answer. Something with her heart, maybe her lungs. He wasn't sure. He ended the call quickly. Diane added it to the timeline. Another convenient emergency. Another reason to keep me away. 2 days later, Dylan called back. What he'd found made my hands shake. Rebecca had been telling different people completely different stories about her illness. Cancer to my mother. A heart condition to one cousin. A rare blood disorder to a neighbor. Dylan said real patients didn't do that. Their diagnoses didn't shift based on the audience. He also found gaps in Rebecca's employment history and addresses that didn't line up with what she'd told my stepfather. He said he was digging deeper. Meanwhile, Lisa contacted a hospital administrator she trusted, someone who could legally confirm whether Rebecca had ever been treated for serious illness anywhere in their network. 3 days later, the answer came back in writing. Rebecca had no history of treatment for any terminal condition. The documentation was official, stamped, and undeniable. Lisa told us quietly that the hospital took medical fraud seriously. If Rebecca had been using fake documents, it could become a criminal matter. Tom went to check on my mother in person. He found her thinner, tired, but smiling too much, like someone trying to convince themselves everything was fine. Rebecca sat nearby the entire time, cutting in whenever Tom tried to ask questions. My mother kept saying she needed to make every moment count. That Rebecca didn't have much time left. Tom left feeling helpless and angry. The next morning, I drove to my mother's house myself. Rebecca answered the door wearing my mother's robe. When she saw me, she pressed a hand to her chest and said seeing me caused her physical distress. She gasped dramatically, leaning against the doorframe like she might collapse. I realized then that I wasn't witnessing emotion, I was watching a performance. One she'd rehearsed many times. My stepfather appeared behind her and blocked the doorway when I tried to speak to my mother. Rebecca smiled slightly as the door closed in my face. When Diane and I met Abigail again, we brought everything. The hospital records. Dylan's findings. Tom's report. Abigail said we were building a strong case, but we needed more proof of a pattern. She warned us not to confront my mother directly yet. Rebecca had too much influence. Any push now would likely drive her deeper under Rebecca's control. That evening, Dylan called again. He'd tracked down a former co-worker of Rebecca's named Phyllis. She'd agreed to meet us and bring her daughter, who'd known Rebecca in high school. Dylan said their stories matched what we were seeing now. Fake illnesses. Emotional manipulation. Money taken under false pretenses. The same cycle, over and over. I sat awake that night staring at my phone, realizing something terrifying. Rebecca hadn't just inserted herself into my mother's life randomly. She followed patterns. She chose targets carefully. And my mother, lonely after divorce and eager for family harmony, had been the perfect mark. We met Phyllis and her daughter Danielle at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town, the kind of place where people stayed long enough to talk without worrying about being overheard. Phyllis looked exhausted in the way only someone who had once trusted the wrong person could look. Danielle clutched a thick folder to her chest like it contained something fragile. We ordered drinks and slid into a corner booth. Phyllis didn't waste time. She pulled out her phone and showed me pictures from 5 years earlier, office group shots from an insurance company downtown. Rebecca was in them, smiling brightly, her head tilted just slightly, the same practiced expression I'd seen at my mother's house. Phyllis told us Rebecca had arrived at their workplace claiming she was battling cancer and needed the job for insurance coverage. The story had been detailed, emotional, and delivered in carefully timed pieces. At first it was doctor appointments, then treatments, then side effects. Everyone felt sorry for her. People covered her shifts. They passed envelopes of cash when she mentioned medical bills. The company organized fundraisers. Over 6 months, Rebecca collected more than $15,000 from co-workers who genuinely believed they were saving her life. Phyllis said the truth came out accidentally. One of the employees' husbands worked at the hospital Rebecca claimed to attend. He mentioned casually that he'd never seen her there. Management investigated quietly and discovered Rebecca had never been a patient anywhere. No treatments. No diagnosis. Nothing. When confronted, Rebecca didn't cry or apologize. She negotiated. She agreed to return most of the money in exchange for being allowed to resign quietly instead of facing charges. Within a week, she vanished. New phone number. New address. New story. Danielle opened her folder then and spread out screenshots from old social media accounts. She explained that Rebecca had done similar things in high school, targeting vulnerable people, inserting herself into their lives quickly, creating crises that made her the center of attention. She'd split friend groups apart with rumors, always positioning herself as the victim. Danielle pointed to a photo of a girl who looked unsettlingly like me. Same hair, similar build. She said Rebecca had accused that girl of bullying her until the pressure became unbearable and the girl changed schools. The lie about me resembling a childhood bully wasn't trauma. It was strategy. Dylan leaned forward and explained that this behavior fit a textbook pattern. Rebecca studied people. She identified emotional weaknesses, loneliness, guilt, the desire to feel needed, and exploited them until there was nothing left to take. When the risk of exposure grew, she moved on. Phyllis and Danielle handed over everything they had, documents, screenshots, contact information for others who'd been manipulated. As we left the cafe, I felt sick but strangely validated. I wasn't imagining things. Rebecca was dangerous. That weekend, we organized everything into folders. Financial manipulation. Fake illnesses. False identities. A repeating cycle across years and locations. Then Tom found something that made my stomach twist. Rebecca had active social media accounts documenting her journey caring for her dying mother, my mother. She posted photos of them together, captions full of gratitude and heartbreak. Strangers commented with sympathy and praise, calling her an angel. There was no mention of me anywhere. In her online world, my mother had only one daughter. Worse, Rebecca had started a small fundraising page claiming the money would help with medical expenses. My mother wasn't sick at all. 2 days later, Dylan called with another bombshell. He'd found Rebecca's ex-husband. The man agreed to talk. He said Rebecca had faked a pregnancy during their marriage. She'd shown him ultrasound photos, talked about baby names, cried about complications. Then she claimed she miscarried and needed money for medical care and therapy. He discovered the ultrasound images were stock photos downloaded online. When confronted, Rebecca laughed. He divorced her immediately. He was willing to testify. We met with Abigail again and laid everything out. She listened carefully and said we were close. Very close. What we needed now was proof of financial exploitation involving my mother. As if on cue, Diane received a call that evening from my mother's financial advisor, a man who'd worked with her for decades. He was worried. There had been large withdrawals and unfamiliar transfers. My mother wasn't returning his calls. When he came over the next day with account statements, the numbers were devastating. Over $40,000 had been withdrawn in months. A joint account had been opened in Rebecca's name. Money moved in and disappeared out. The pattern matched Rebecca's past scams exactly. Dylan moved fast. He subpoenaed bank records. What came back was worse than expected. Rebecca had opened multiple accounts using my mother's address. Money flowed into all of them. Small transfers at first, then larger ones. Abigail said we now had enough for legal action. Fraud. Elder exploitation. Undue influence. But she warned that it would become public and painful for my mother. Before filing anything, Diane suggested one last attempt, talking to my stepfather privately. When we confronted him with the evidence, he broke. He admitted Rebecca had threatened him. He said she wasn't his biological daughter at all. She'd approached him years earlier, claimed to be his child, then blackmailed him into helping her get close to my mother. He said he was terrified. That was when we realized the full scope of it. Rebecca hadn't just infiltrated my mother's life. She'd engineered the entire situation from the beginning. Once my stepfather admitted the truth, everything shifted from confusion to urgency. He sat in his car with us, hands shaking, explaining how Rebecca had trapped him long before my mother ever met her. She'd approached him claiming to be his long-lost daughter, armed with just enough personal details to seem convincing. When a paternity test proved she wasn't related to him at all, she didn't panic. She smiled. Then she threatened him. She said she had recordings, private emails, access to accounts. She said if he didn't cooperate, she would destroy his reputation and accuse him of abuse. By the time he realized how dangerous she was already embedded in his life, and steering him straight toward my mother. He admitted he'd watched helplessly as Rebecca isolated my mother, rewrote family narratives, and drained accounts. He knew it was wrong, but fear kept him silent. Listening to him, I felt anger, pity, and horror all at once. Rebecca hadn't just manipulated one person. She'd built a web. Diane didn't hesitate. She started making calls immediately. If Rebecca was escalating, and everything suggested she was, we needed to reach my mother without Rebecca present. We contacted the Hendersons, longtime neighbors who'd known me since childhood. They agreed to help without question. They'd noticed my mother's weight loss, how she never went anywhere alone anymore, how Rebecca hovered like a guard. The plan was simple and risky. Mrs. Henderson would invite my mother over for coffee the next morning. Rebecca usually left mid-morning for what she called medical appointments, which we now knew were bank visits. That window might be our only chance. The next morning felt unreal. I sat on the Hendersons' couch with Diane, my stomach in knots, rehearsing what I'd say if my mother walked in and immediately turned around. When she arrived alone, she looked smaller somehow. Fragile. She said she couldn't stay long. Then she saw me. Her face drained of color and she moved toward the door, but Mrs. Henderson gently asked her to sit, just for 10 minutes. I started talking before fear could stop me. I told her I loved her. That I wasn't angry. That I was scared. Diane laid the documents out slowly on the coffee table like evidence in court. Rebecca's medical records. Bank statements. Witness accounts. The paternity test. My mother denied it at first, shaking her head, insisting Rebecca was dying. But denial cracks when faced with proof. When Diane placed the hospital records in her hands, something broke. My mother sobbed, repeating the same words over and over, that she'd known something felt wrong but couldn't bear to face it. Then her phone started buzzing. Rebecca. Message after message. Demands. Accusations. Threats disguised as concern. My mother stared at the screen like she didn't recognize the person texting her. When Rebecca called, my mother answered, and put it on speaker. The voice that came through wasn't soft or weak. It was furious. Cruel. Rebecca insulted her, accused her of betrayal, admitted how easy it had been to manipulate her. She bragged about the money, the lies, the plan she'd almost completed. She didn't know she was confessing to a room full of witnesses. My stepfather hit record without saying a word. For nearly 10 minutes, Rebecca ranted, revealing everything: fake illnesses, stolen money, planned escape. When she finally hung up, the room was silent. I called the police. Diane called Abigail. Officers were dispatched immediately. We were told not to go back to the house. When they arrived, they found Rebecca packing bags, jewelry spread across the bed, cash and financial documents stuffed into her purse. She was arrested on the spot. fraud, theft, elder exploitation. The words sounded unreal when the officer said them. The days that followed moved fast. Statements. Evidence collection. My mother moved out of the house and stayed with Diane. She barely slept, replaying everything Rebecca had said on that call. My stepfather began therapy almost immediately, consumed by guilt. The district attorney reviewed the case and said it was strong, stronger than most. Rebecca had done this before, and now there was proof. When I finally sat alone with my mother days later, she cried and apologized until there were no words left. She said loneliness had made her reckless. That she'd believed Rebecca because she wanted to feel needed. I told her the truth, that forgiveness wouldn't be quick or automatic. That what she'd done had changed something between us. She nodded and said she understood. Once Rebecca was taken away, the house my mother had lived in for decades no longer felt like a home. Police sealed rooms, tagged documents, and photographed drawers while my mother sat silently at Diane's dining table staring into a cup of untouched tea. She kept apologizing, to me, to Diane, to herself, but none of the words seemed to land anywhere solid. The reality of what had happened was sinking in slowly, like a bruise blooming long after the impact. Abigail moved quickly, filing emergency motions to freeze all remaining accounts and prevent any further financial damage. Within 48 hours, Rebecca's access was cut off, and the bank confirmed that some of the stolen funds could be recovered. Not all of it. That loss hit my mother harder than I expected, not because of the money itself, but because it represented years of work and trust handed over to someone who never deserved either. The district attorney contacted us soon after. Rebecca's pattern of fraud across state lines elevated the case, and prosecutors were eager to move forward. My stepfather gave a full statement, detailing how Rebecca had blackmailed him into silence. Watching him relive it was painful. He cried openly, his voice breaking as he described how he'd convinced himself he was protecting his marriage, when in reality he'd been helping destroy it. Therapy became mandatory for him, not by court order, but by necessity. He couldn't function without it. My mother refused to return home while the investigation continued. She stayed with Diane, sleeping in the guest room, keeping the lights on at night like a child afraid of the dark. She told me she couldn't stand the silence of the house anymore, how every corner reminded her of Rebecca's voice and lies. When Abigail reviewed the will changes, she was confident they would be reversed. The speed, the isolation, and the recorded confession left little room for legal doubt. My mother signed documents restoring the original will and added additional safeguards so nothing like this could ever happen again. We began the long, uncomfortable process of rebuilding trust. My mother asked to see me weekly. Not to fix things, she said, just to be present. Our first coffee meeting was stiff and awkward. We sat across from each other like strangers, carefully choosing neutral topics. She didn't touch her drink. I told her I was still angry. She didn't argue. She said she expected nothing else. That honesty mattered more than comfort. The bank eventually recovered most of the stolen funds. My mother insisted on splitting what came back with me. I refused at first, but Diane told me later that this wasn't about money, it was about accountability. I accepted, understanding that for my mother, this was a tangible way to acknowledge the harm she'd caused. 2 weeks later, Diane hosted a small family gathering. Nothing celebratory. Just people who had shown up when it mattered. My mother brought a wooden box I recognized immediately. Inside was my grandmother's jewelry, every piece Rebecca had nearly sold. As my mother handed each item to me, she told its story. By the time she reached the charm bracelet, her voice broke. She said she almost lost more than money. She almost lost her daughter forever. Rebecca's attorney contacted the prosecutor with a plea offer. The choice was clear: risk a trial with uncertain outcomes or accept guaranteed consequences. My mother and I agreed. When Rebecca stood in court and pleaded guilty, she looked smaller without her practiced vulnerability. No tears. No trembling voice. The sentence was 5 years. It wasn't enough, but it was real. After the sentencing, my mother hosted a quiet dinner for family only. No speeches. No banners. Just a simple acknowledgement of her birthday surrounded by people who loved her without conditions. She apologized publicly, briefly, sincerely, and didn't make excuses. When she looked at me, there was humility there I hadn't seen before. Life didn't snap back into place once Rebecca was sentenced. If anything, the quiet that followed made everything heavier. Without the chaos, there was nothing left to distract us from what had broken. My mother started therapy with a specialist who dealt with manipulation and emotional abuse. During her first session, she told the therapist she felt ashamed. Ashamed that she'd believed a stranger over her own child. A shame that she'd needed to feel wanted badly enough to let someone erase me from her life. The therapist didn't let her stay in self-punishment. She explained that Rebecca hadn't just lied, she'd studied and targeted vulnerability, and that manipulation worked precisely because it didn't feel like manipulation at the time. Understanding that helped my mother breathe again, but it didn't erase the damage. My stepfather attended therapy separately at first. He struggled with guilt more than anything else. He told Diane he replayed every moment where he could have spoken up but didn't. He kept asking whether stopping Rebecca earlier would have saved his marriage. Eventually, my mother agreed to attend joint sessions with him. They sat on opposite ends of the couch for weeks, navigating grief, betrayal, and the reality that both of them had been used. Their therapist told them rebuilding trust would require transparency so complete it would feel uncomfortable. Shared passwords. Open finances. No secrets. They agreed. My mother and I met weekly, just as we'd promised. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we sat in silence, walking through a park or sipping coffee without eye contact. I told her I didn't know if our relationship would ever feel the same. She said she accepted that. She stopped asking for reassurance. That mattered. I needed space to feel everything, anger, sadness, disappointment, without being rushed toward forgiveness for her comfort. One afternoon, she brought the photo album I'd made for her birthday. She said she'd found it unopened in the trunk of her car where she'd hidden it the night she told me not to come. She'd been too ashamed to look at it before. We went through it together, page by page. She cried quietly at the pictures of my childhood, the milestones she'd nearly thrown away for someone who'd never loved her at all. When she reached the last page, she said something that stuck with me. She said she finally understood that love didn't need to be dramatic to be real. It didn't need crises or urgency. It just needed consistency. And she'd forgotten that. Rebecca faded from our daily conversations, but her shadow lingered. The prosecutor contacted us again to finalize restitution details. Some of the money Rebecca had stolen was gone forever. My mother accepted that. She said the real loss had been time and trust, and she wasn't willing to lose more by staying bitter. She focused on repairing what she could. Family dynamics shifted in unexpected ways. Diane became more than an aunt. She checked in daily, defended boundaries fiercely, and made sure my mother didn't slip back into old patterns of guilt-driven decision-making. Cousins I'd barely spoken to before started showing up more, drawn together by what we'd survived. In losing one person who never truly belonged, we'd somehow found each other again. Months passed. The routine of weekly meetings softened into something less strained. I started to see change in my mother, not performative apologies, but consistent behavior. She listened more than she spoke. She stopped centering her feelings when I talked about my hurt. She respected boundaries without arguing. That was new. It didn't fix everything, but it mattered. One evening, she asked if I'd consider attending a joint therapy session together. Not to force reconciliation, she said, just to talk with guidance. I thought about it for days before agreeing. In that session, I told her exactly how it felt to be erased. How standing outside her house while she planned a celebration without me rewired something inside me. How knowing she'd changed her made me question my worth to her entirely. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. She cried. But she listened. When it was her turn, she said she didn't expect forgiveness. She just wanted the chance to earn back a place in my life. That was when I realized something had shifted. Forgiveness wasn't a single decision. It was a process, one built on repeated choices and accountability. I wasn't ready to declare everything healed, but I was willing to keep showing up. 3 months after everything unraveled, my life looked nothing like it had before that late-night phone call. The distance between my mother and me was no longer sharp and hostile, but it wasn't healed either. It felt careful, deliberate, like walking across thin ice that might hold if you moved slowly enough. We kept our weekly meetings, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting together in silence. She never pushed. That restraint became the clearest sign that something in her had truly changed. She wasn't trying to earn forgiveness through grand gestures or emotional speeches. She was doing it through consistency, through showing up exactly as promised and nothing more. The legal aftermath wrapped itself up quietly. The restitution process recovered what it could, and the rest was written off as loss, another entry on a long list of things Rebecca had taken. My mother accepted that without argument. She said clinging to anger felt too much like staying connected to Rebecca, and she was done giving her any more space in her life. She sold the house a few months later. She said she couldn't live in a place where every room reminded her of how easily she'd been manipulated. Watching her hand over the keys was strange. That house had been my childhood. But I understood. Sometimes the only way forward is to leave the evidence behind. My stepfather moved out temporarily while they continued therapy. Their marriage didn't survive in the way it had existed before Rebecca, but it didn't end in bitterness either. They redefined it carefully, acknowledging that both of them had been broken in different ways by the same person. Whether they would stay together long-term remained uncertain, but they were finally making decisions based on truth instead of fear. That mattered more than appearances. Rebecca's name came up less and less. When it did, it was factual, stripped of emotion. 5 years. No early release. No dramatic letters from prison. Just consequences. The woman who had thrived on chaos and control had lost the only power she ever really valued, access to people who trusted her. Knowing that didn't bring joy, but it brought relief. The kind that lets your body finally unclench after months of holding its breath. One afternoon, my mother invited me to lunch at a small cafe near her new apartment. Nothing fancy. No expectations. Over sandwiches, she told me she'd been working through something in therapy, the difference between being needed and being loved. She said she'd confused the two for a long time, especially after her divorce. Rebecca had made her feel essential, urgent, chosen. But it had never been love. Love, she said quietly, was what stayed even when there was nothing to gain. She looked at me then, not with desperation or guilt, but with clarity. She said she understood now that she might never get back what she'd broken. And she accepted that. That acceptance was what finally allowed me to breathe. I didn't have to decide everything at once. I didn't have to label forgiveness or promise reconciliation. I could let our relationship exist exactly where it was, unfinished, fragile, but honest. For the first time since this began, that felt enough. My life outside of her changed too. I leaned harder into the people who had shown up without hesitation. Diane became a permanent fixture in my daily life. She didn't replace my mother, but she filled a space I hadn't realized was empty, the space where safety lives. Cousins I'd barely known before became close. Shared crisis has a way of stripping away surface-level relationships and revealing who's real. I stopped feeling like the problem that needed to be fixed and started recognizing that I had never been the issue at all. One evening, months later, my mother asked if I would help her reorganize old photo boxes she'd brought from storage. I hesitated, then agreed. We sat on the floor of her apartment going through decades of memories. Birthday candles. School plays. Bad haircuts. There I was, everywhere. Evidence of a bond that had existed long before Rebecca ever learned our names. My mother paused on one picture of us laughing on a beach when I was 10. She said she didn't understand how she'd let anyone convince her that connection like that could be replaced. I didn't answer. Some questions don't need responses. They just need to be asked out loud. As we packed the photos away, I realized something unexpected. The story wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about boundaries. About choosing who had access to me and under what conditions. About understanding that love doesn't excuse harm, and forgiveness doesn't erase accountability. My mother was no longer on a pedestal. She was a person who had made devastating choices and was now living with their consequences. And I was no longer the daughter who would accept anything just to be chosen. That shift changed everything. On her next birthday, we didn't throw a party. We took a quiet walk instead. No speeches. No photos for strangers. Just two people trying to build something new from what was left. When she thanked me for coming, I told her the truth. I said I was there because I chose to be, not because I felt obligated. She nodded like she understood exactly how significant that distinction was. I don't know what our relationship will look like years from now. I don't know if full forgiveness will ever arrive, or if this careful version of love is what we'll always have. But I know this. Being someone's daughter doesn't mean surrendering your worth. Family isn't defined by who gets priority at a party or whose name is written into a will. It's defined by who protects you when it costs them something. And now, finally, I know how to protect myself.